Hey everybody, welcome back to Delilah's channel. She is still at her board and train until the 16th, so I am taking this week's video over to talk about service dogs, the laws around them, and how they differ from other working animals. First off, let's define what a service dog is. Service dogs are task-trained to mitigate their handler's specific disabilities, both visible and not. There's no minimum task requirement, and there's no registration or certification recognized as legitimate under federal law. They are protected under the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I'll go over later. That act allows them to have access to wherever the general public is allowed to go as long as they're with their handler, with the exception of sterile environments like operating rooms, burn units, etc., and some religious institutions without prior approval. Service dogs are also protected under the Fair Housing Act and the Air Carrier Access Act, both of which I will also talk about more later. Service dogs can only be denied or asked to leave for unruly or dangerous behaviors not befitting of their title. I also think it's important to note that miniature horses are also protected under the ADA as service animals. Service animals differ from therapy dogs in that therapy dogs are trained to provide comfort and support to many people and must be able to render their services in various environments, such as hospitals, nursing homes, libraries, and schools, for example. They're often also seen at, trauma sites to comfort the witnesses and victims of whatever trauma might have happened. In the eyes of housing and public access, they're only considered pets and really have no public access rights, meaning that they can only go into non-pet friendly places when they're invited to do a therapy session. Otherwise, they are just a pet able to go around to places like pet stores or other businesses that allow animals. Emotional support animals is also a term you've heard a lot lately in the news. They are also not required to have any training whatsoever, not just task training. No training is required for them, and their function is specifically to provide comfort to their person with a disability. They are protected under the Housing Act, so they can live in no-pet housing or live in pet-friendly housing without pet fees or deposits. But they aren't granted public access rights, so they can't go just anywhere, similar to therapy dogs. I'd like to also make a very clear distinction that emotional support animals do help to mitigate psychiatric disabilities in the home environment. There are, however, service dogs for psychiatric needs, and they are not the same thing. Psychiatric service dogs help do tasks or work to help mitigate psychiatric disabilities, while emotional support animals only help these disabilities just simply by being there. They provide comfort through their presence, essentially. There is a fourth, lesser-known term that gets passed around a bit called facility dogs, where a dog, resides in the facility or is usually at this one place. Those are usually therapy dogs. The difference I think that they're trying to make is that this dog specifically works at this one place, but they can be task trained to help the people in their facility, but that doesn't make them a service dog because they have to be task trained for one person's specific disabilities and not doing cool tricks to help other people and a large crowd, for example. So now we'll get into laws that I think everyone should know, but a lot of people actually don't unless they're in the service dog community or close with someone who is in the service dog community. First, we'll talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA is what protects service dog teams from discrimination. Service dogs are defined there as a dog that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with disabilities. The task or tasks performed by the dog must be directly related to the person's disability. So this is saying that the handler must be disabled, the dog must be trained to do at least one task or work, and that task or work must be directly related to mitigate that handler's disability. For example, I'm considered disabled by my anxiety and panic disorder, among other things, but I'm not considered disabled by my asthma. If my service dog were to perform a task that would help with my anxiety, that would qualify her towards being a service dog. If my service dog were to perform a task related to my asthma, that would just be a cool trick. It would be helpful for me, but it wouldn't count towards her being a service dog because I'm not disabled by my asthma. There are people who are disabled by their asthma, so that gets into the distinction of a diagnosis doesn't mean a disability. Each diagnosis affects everyone differently. So if you're thinking that you need a service dog, talk with your provider to see if you actually are disabled by your diagnosis. Back on track. Businesses can only ask 2 questions to anyone bringing a dog into a store. 1, is that a service dog required for a disability? And 2, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? Remember that comfort or emotional support are not considered valid tasks under the ADA, as those are something that just kind of happen with the dog being around. Also note how the wording specifically doesn't allow room for the business to ask anything about that person's disability or for any paperwork or certificates or ID cards or even a doctor's note. An animal can be denied entry if it's not task trained. So if they answer no, it's not a service dog, clearly it's not going to be let in the store. It also can be denied or removed regardless if whether it's a service dog or not, if it's posing a health risk or a safety risk to others, like if it's aggressive or if it's using the bathroom in the store, things like that, or if it's out of control with no effective action taken by the handler to regain control. So that is clarified with a bark is fine because some people use their dog barking as an alert to an impending medical event. But if the dog keeps barking or won't stop barking or is being aggressive and the handler does nothing to control that, that's when you can ask for the animal to be removed. Businesses are then still obligated to provide their services to the handler, but without the presence of the animal. A fantastic link will be dropped below. It explains more about the frequently asked questions for the ADA. Also, while there is no legitimate registration, some handlers may choose to create business cards, like I did, or pamphlets explaining the ADA law and providing ADA contact information. I will put those here while I'm talking, if I can figure out how to do that. If not, this will totally get edited out. Next, we have the Fair Housing Act. So the FHA is what rules over housing laws. It actually lumps together emotional support animals, service dogs in training, and service dogs together under the umbrella term assistance animals. Despite their differences, the FHA treats them all the same. They're all protected equally, so long as the rental property contains 4 or more units, and that it's not including one that the landlord resides in if the landlord resides on the property. So if the landlord has fewer than 4 units, FHA doesn't apply, and the landlord can kind of set their own rules. Before bringing the animal on the property, you have to request reasonable accommodation with the landlord. This starts a dialogue between the landlord and the handler. If the need for the animal is not obvious, the landlord can request a note from a medical professional, which includes your doctors, specialists, therapists, etc., anyone in the medical field who is treating the person and knows their disability or disabilities, explaining that the person has a disability, and that the animal is either part of the treatment plan or helps mitigate their disabilities. The best outcome is that the request for accommodation is approved, and the handler lives on the property with their animal, not paying a pet fee, deposit, or pet rent per month, or the animal counting towards a pet limit. So, like, if the apartment says you can only have 2 dogs or 2 pets, your service animal or emotional support animal will not count towards that 2-pet limit. So you could have your assistance animal, as the FHA calls them, and 2 others in your apartment and still be abiding by that 2-pet limit. The worst outcome from the perspective of the handler is that the accommodation request is denied due to proof of undue hardship to the landlord. This is usually when the animal living on the property would greatly increase the insurance costs that the landlord would have to pay. I will also be dropping a link below to the Fair Housing Act text. Let's see. Next, we have the Air Carrier Access Act. So, this one is a bit of a struggle. The biggest issues that I feel that the ACAA has is that it allows room for breed discriminations. You probably heard about Delta Airlines bully breed restrictions in the news, and that it lumps together psychiatric service dogs and emotional support animals as being in the same boat, having the same requirements, which are different from medical service dogs, which, in my opinion, is not a good thing. You have both medical service dogs and psychiatric service dogs are task trained to mitigate the handler's disability. The only difference between them is where the handler's disability originates. So, it doesn't make sense for the Air Carrier Access Act to discriminate between different types of disabilities, is what I'm kind of getting at. It also allows for a little bit of wiggle room, so the airlines all seem to have different forms, requirements, etc. for allowing service dogs or emotional support animals. I will also drop a link below for the Air Carrier Access Act. The long and short is make sure you talk with a representative from the airlines that you're flying with before you show up at the gate with your animal. State laws. State laws are usually where service dog teams go to see if, while their animal is still in training, if they can go out in public as a service dog team. For example, Florida gives full access rights to service dogs in training and treats service dogs in training the same as service dogs. Texas laws only give access rights to service dogs in training when they are with approved trainers, which means trainers from a program, having actually spoken to people involved with writing the laws, and doing a lot of deep diving in government websites. North Carolina's laws give access rights to service dogs in training who are marked as being in training. So we have a patch on her vest, and we also are getting one to go on her collar that says in training, and they must be actively in the process of training. So I can't just bring her with me to a store that I want to go shopping at unless that I am actually there working on her training, like getting her used to walking through aisleways that are kind of tight, or like by clothing racks, or working on manners at a checkout counter, etc., etc. I will also drop a great link below with a table of different state laws. It's a great starting point. I really appreciate the people who put this together, as it's definitely nice to be able to see, okay, this is the state, these are their accommodation laws, this is where I need to go start Googling to see what they've been updated to, or if they're still the same as what's on here, because it is occasionally outdated. And finally, I'm going to go over a couple, little important notes. Registries and certifications, as I said earlier, complete scam. We've all seen, online ads for register now to take your pet everywhere, and they're all a waste of money. They're all going to send you, IDs or a vest or certificates and things like that, but none of them are needed for service animals, and none of them can be asked for by a business. So there's really no point to having them. You may be wondering what the big deal is if someone else were to choose to waste their money on an ID like this. because it's their money, their choice how to spend it, right? Not quite. The problem isn't so much them buying the ID or the registry, it's when they use the ID to gain access somewhere. Whether it's housing, to get them cleared with their landlord, or if it's to enter a non-pet friendly business. The reason that this is a problem is if, let's say, Joe goes into a store with his puppy and they stop him at the door and say, "Hey, is that a service animal?" And he's like, "Yeah, I've got my ID right here." They let him go in because a lot of stores are uneducated on these laws. And then if I were to go in and say, "Hey, I've got a service animal," and they're like, "Okay, let me see your ID." I don't have an ID because they're not legal to ask for, and they're not legally required, so why would I waste my money on that? But because the business doesn't know that and sees all these fake IDs, they're going to keep bugging me and think that I'm lying. This is where it gets into a problem for real handlers who don't use IDs. This is why it's a problem. This is why all the handlers who see people registering their pets get really mad. So, don't do it. Disclaimer here, therapy animals can have a registration or certification process, but it depends on which organization they partner with and who they work for. So what about state registries? Because some states do have a registration process, like North Carolina. State registries are fine and well, but also optional. For the same reason as mentioned before, you shouldn't show state IDs either. They shouldn't be shown for access or for landlord accommodation requests. When it comes to these laws, whichever law grants the handler more rights is the one that's followed in the moment. For example, service dogs in training aren't given access rights by federal law, but some states will give access rights to people who are training their service animals. Or, for some states, they don't recognize psychiatric service animals, but the Americans with Disabilities Act does. So, in that case, you'd be protected by federal law and not protected by state law. So you would follow federal law in that instance. There's another example I wanted to mention was service cats. Now, you might be thinking, how the hell can you train a cat? Well, cats are actually really intelligent, so if you find the right cat and can train it to help mitigate your disabilities, some states will recognize them. Not all, not even most, but some do. I think Ohio is one of them, but don't quote me. If they were to travel outside of the state with their service cat, they might not be recognized in that state, and they aren't protected by federal law. So really, really read up on your laws if you choose to go that route, but for all the complications that there are, I wouldn't recommend it. So, what should be done to combat the epidemic of fake service animals? Education. It's the biggest reason that I'm doing this, is because the more I educate people, the fewer fakes that I see, and the fewer instances where my dog is put in risk of other animals being somewhere they shouldn't be. The biggest reason that pets are allowed into non-pet friendly places is that stores are uneducated on their rights. But also, many stores don't allow the employees to ask both questions because they're afraid to get sued. We're in a very defensive state where if my access is infringed upon, if my rights are infringed upon, there's always that question of, oh, well, they're going to sue. If you're following the law and educated on the law, that shouldn't be something you have to worry about. But another level of education that's missing is often law enforcement. I've seen many a handler call the police after being discriminated against or denied access into businesses, and then only to have to educate the officers once they arrive. It's not on the handlers to educate, but we often have to if we want to go anywhere. Long story short, I think that education should start in the school system. it should be taught maybe in health class or something like that, and not just when a kid in the school gets a service animal to prompt a need to educate. And that's really all I've got. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I've got Delilah's email, I'll show that at the end, and we've got all this information below. Also, feel free to comment, give us any feedback. This is just kind of me rambling. I also don't have my glasses on, so apologies for kind of squinting generally down here. But yeah, thank you. I hope you enjoyed.